Well, hello, and welcome to Women of Color, Money and Legacy, where I talk money matters. I share strategies to empower us to become financially literate in terms of managing our money wisely, building generational wealth, financial freedom, and creating a legacy. And if you enjoy this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. That being said, let's jump right into it. Today, I want to talk to you about the racial wealth gap in America, which has widened during this pandemic. I'll be sharing facts and figures so that you understand the gravity of the wealth disparity that exists between blacks, other minorities, and whites in America. In this video, I'm going to focus on 4 factors that contribute to this wealth disparity. Now, this is a complex issue because it is so ingrained in American society. This topic has been bantered around by scholars and leaders in government and the black community. Some people say that reparations is the answer. Others are saying that we should support our own. This video is not meant to be a knock on any race. I'm just simply sharing facts today. So I'm going to focus on 4 contributing factors to the racial gap in America and where we go from here. As blacks and people of color, you need to see the overarching cause and effect through broader lenses and not just your own bubble, okay? So let's get into it. 4 factors that have contributed to the racial wealth gap in America that I want to discuss are history, opportunity or lack thereof, the pandemic, and choices. Now, many whites will suggest that America is in a post-racial era because after all, we had a black president and I have black friends. And I will say that America has come a long way since slavery, and yes, I'm going to go there today. But your economic past has not been reconciled. Let's start by talking about the first factor, which is history. The economy of America was built upon racism, slavery. That's a fact. It's a truth that many white Americans find difficult to discuss. They become offensive when confronted with this truth. Yet it is a fact, and we need to have an open dialogue in order to make progress. Slavery started in 1619 and gave slave owners 250 years of free labor. Native Americans also suffered from whites who were stealing, looting, and pillaging their land. This notion of just get over it is ingrained in the psyche of many white Americans because that is an atrocious past they simply don't want to deal with. Many of them want to sugarcoat the narrative and try to rewrite history. Some will argue there is no such thing as white privilege. There is wealth disparity because blacks are lazy, they're criminals, they're savages, anything to evade having an open and honest dialogue. America was built on the backs of slaves. It was a business. White slave owners became wealthy from slave trade, and they passed that wealth down to their slave owner sons from generation to generation. Now, slavery ended in 1865, and your great-great-grandfathers had to start from scratch. There was no wealth passed down to them. That 40 acres and a mule proclamation got reversed, and that land was restored back to their white owners after President Lincoln was assassinated. Most of the free slaves couldn't even read. If they were caught reading, they were either beaten or killed. And for the ones who survived, it was an uphill battle. I say that to say this: black Americans did not start with a level playing field. When your ancestors stepped up to the plate, they were swinging with 2 strikes already against them, while white America was already on third base. That's a gap that can't be denied. Now, let's just jump ahead and take a look at the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, also referred to as Black Wall Street. It is considered one of the single most incidents of racial violence in America and the deadliest terrorist attacks in the history of the United States. The Tulsa Race Massacre was a 2-day attack during the Memorial Day weekend where a mob of hundreds of white men destroyed the homes and businesses of black people in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, one of the wealthiest communities, black communities, in the country at that time. The mob burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood. More than 800 people were hospitalized and up to 300 people died. About 10,000 black people were left homeless. Their homes and businesses were destroyed. And many of the survivors just left Tulsa altogether. Black Wall Street was considered the black mecca of success and wealth. The area had over 600 businesses, 200 actually registered. Some were unlisted, some were sole proprietors, with a population between 10,000 and 15,000 blacks. They didn't need to leave their community for anything. Imagine that. The first business was built in 1906. Now let me give you a rundown of some of the businesses and professions. There were beauty parlors, barbershops, doctors, grocery stores, hotels, funeral homes, pool halls, theaters, restaurants, transportation services, drugstores, nightclubs, banks, insurance, lawyers, real estate agents, newspapers, churches, junior high school, even a hospital, and the list goes on. Now you understand why it was called Black Wall Street. But the lower economic white people looked over and saw what the black community created, and many of them were jealous. I bring up the Black Wall Street Massacre because generations of black wealth was destroyed in 2 days. One of those black business owners by the name of J.B. Stratford owned a hotel that was attacked. His great-grandson John Rogers said the property was valued at $125,000 at the time. Today, it would be worth over $100 million. Let that sink in. Then you had the Rosewood Massacre in 1923, where another self-sufficient black town was destroyed in Florida. The residents, they just abandoned the town and never moved back. They never were compensated for the land they lost, and the town just ceased to exist. I share these stories of slavery and Black Wall Street and the Rosewood Massacres to give you a history lesson about how racism at the direct hands of white men has contributed to the wealth gap in America. And these are just facts. Let's move on and talk about the second factor that has contributed to the wealth gap in America, and that is opportunity. This is where we get into systemic or institutional racism that unfairly elevates whites over blacks and other minorities. For generations, racist policies and practices have deprived many people of color, particularly blacks and Native Americans, of opportunities to accumulate wealth and stripped them of any wealth they had acquired, which I just pointed out. This disparity deprived you of access to stable housing and quality education or the ability to invest in the future. You had Jim Crow laws that mandated racial segregation. In 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal doctrine, which in reality was anything but equal. And under this legal doctrine, public facilities and transportation for blacks were inferior and underfunded, if at all, compared to facilities for whites. In effect, what Jim Crow laws did was relegate most blacks to second-class citizens with its institutionalized disadvantages economically, educationally, politically, and socially. In 1909, the NAACP was founded to lead the protests against the so-called separate but equal doctrine. But it wasn't until 1954 that the U.S. Supreme Court declared school segregation to be unconstitutional in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. And the remaining Jim Crow laws were finally overturned by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's generations of institutionalized racism that denied blacks equal access and opportunities. Now, I'm grateful for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but did they change the hearts of the KKK? Absolutely not. And did you know that right here in Georgia where I live, the Augusta National Golf Club did not invite its first black member until 1990, 26 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So let's not get it twisted. Racism did not vanish. It just became more subtle and covert. Systemic racism created a gap in housing, education, employment, incarceration, mortality, drugs, immigration, a host of discriminatory practices. Now I'm switching gears here for a moment to make a point. In 2009, President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act to protect against pay discrimination. Lilly Ledbetter worked at Goodyear for 20 years, and it wasn't until the year before she was set to retire that she found out that she had been making significantly less than her male colleagues with similar seniority and experience. She sued Goodyear and won. Thus, the act was passed. Now, Lilly Ledbetter was a white woman. Now, if this white woman was being discriminated against in the workplace, it only stands to reason that the pay disparity between black women in similar position to these white men would have been even more wide. This notion that black people want preferential treatment in hiring is totally unfounded. No, black people as a race are not looking for a handout or anything based upon skin color alone. Just like Lilly Ledbetter, black people want equal treatment and equal opportunities, and not to be denied opportunities because of skin colors. It is a fact that the lack of opportunities has hindered the progress of Black wealth in America. Let's move on and talk about a third factor that has contributed to the wealth gap in America, and that is the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic further widened the wealth gap between Black and white households. Black households didn't have very much in terms of wealth and savings to start with, so the financial demands during the pandemic made it even more burdensome. You didn't have the luxury of deciding to stay home to protect yourself or your family against the virus. You were disproportionately exposed to the virus, which increased your likelihood of coming down with severe complications compared to your white counterparts. White households had greater access to savings, so it was less difficult for them to weather unemployment, healthcare emergencies, and remote learning for their children. Also, Black households didn't have the resources to maintain and grow their businesses to the same degree as white households. Then you had the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP as it was called, part of the CARES Act. The PPP program was set aside to provide loans to help small and medium-sized businesses that were the hardest hit during the pandemic. Well, it was not equally accessible to Black-owned businesses. It was not. There were huge discrepancies in banking practices. Now, initially, the bank's role in the program was that of approving the loan applications. Well, guess who you think the banks approved first before the money ran out? People they knew. It wasn't equitable. You had these large businesses getting millions of dollars in funding that didn't even need the money, but they had connections with the bank. Over $436 million of the over $1.3 billion in loans were received by 450 public companies that ended up having to return that money once it came to light. Now, let me throw out some analytics from the Associated Press. Their data showed that for the initial loans from the CARES Act, April 3rd through August 8th, nearly twice the number of PPP loans were approved for business owners living in the 20% of zip codes with the greatest proportion of white residents than were approved for business owners living in the 20% of zip codes with the smallest proportion of whites. Another study of the PPP loans found that the success rate for white applicants was 60%, compared to a success rate of 29% for Black applicants. No one should be surprised by these stats. There has long been structural racism from our financial institutions. These large commercial banks have a long history of reserving their services for whites and white communities while excluding Blacks and communities of color. Now, let's look a little deeper at the workforce during the pandemic, shall we? The pay equity during the pandemic was relatively less about pay rate, but more about the disproportionate share of women, particularly Black women, becoming unemployed. Most of these jobs were among low-wage occupations, including waitresses, childcare, and retail, industries that have employed a disproportionate share of women in general. And that being said, it should also be noted that globally, the pandemic cost women over $800 billion in lost incomes in 2020, according to Oxfam, which is a charitable organization that focuses on ending global poverty. The data also shows that nearly 18% of American Black women lost their jobs between February 2020 and April 2020, compared to 13.2% of white men. Unemployment for Black women is currently around 6%. And throughout the pandemic, the unemployment rate for Black women has been consistently higher than that of Latinas, Asian, and white women. Some possible factors that contribute to the recovery gap are hiring discrimination, burnout from being frontline workers, and a lack of decent benefits in lower paying industries. Now, there has always been a wage disparity along gender and racial lines. White women earn 82 cents on the dollar and Black women 61 cents on the dollar compared to their white male colleagues. So this data shouldn't be surprising. Let me move on and talk about the fourth factor that has contributed to the wealth gap in America, and that is choices. There have been all types of discussions about how to bridge the racial gap in America, as I stated earlier, from reparations to supporting Black businesses. Those discussions will continue, and that's important. But how do you and I individually and collectively strive to tackle this seemingly insurmountable challenge? I don't know about you, but I have never been one to sit around waiting for answers from the outside. but rather making choices that are within my immediate control. Now let me throw out some more statistics. In 2019, the Federal Reserve Board reported that the median net worth for Black families was $24,000. For Hispanic families, it was $36,000. And for white families, it was $189,000. The primary way Americans build wealth is through retirement plans, and Black folk are lacking in that regard. Ariel Investments, which is a Chicago-based investment firm, reports that on average, white household 401k participants invested 26% more than Black household 401k participants. This doesn't include low-income wages. We're talking about households with incomes of $50,000 or more. This same study showed that twice as many Black participants in the plan borrowed money from their 401k than white participants. A Pew Research in 2020 found that only 31% of Black households even participate in their employer 401k plan, compared to 61% participation of white households. Let that sink in. And many employers don't even offer their employees a retirement plan. But regardless, whether low income or no retirement plan, you can and should be investing in the stock market. And you can start with a small amount. And now, I don't want to bore you with statistics, but I want you to get a clear picture of the gravity of the racial wealth gap and where we go from here. The Federal Reserve Board study also found that the average value of stocks owned by Blacks in America amounted to only $14,000. That's nearly a quarter of what their white peers held. And let me just interject this. The stock market tanked in March of 2020 when the pandemic first hit. But if you were in the market when it started its recovery later on that year, you made a killing. And if you didn't make a killing, you definitely made significant gains, because it was the fastest bull run since World War II. And where did Black folk have their money during this run? In the past 2 years especially, Black Americans held less risky assets such as insurance and bonds, which have lower returns than stocks. Come on now. I'm going to end it on that note. The question that I want to ask is not where do we go from here? My question to you is, where do you go from here? Now, we can't rewrite history, but we can change our destiny by taking responsibility for our actions and outcomes. Where do you go from here? And I want you to record your answer in your financial journal. Now, next week, I'm going to go more in depth about the stock market, because wealth is made primarily by investing in the stock market. We have got to get over the stigma that many of us have attached to it. And for the longest time, I was leery of the stock market. I considered it the boogeyman. I steered clear of it. Not anymore. It has become my vehicle of choice for building wealth. Ordinary people are becoming millionaires every day by investing in the stock market. You're not too young and you're not too old to invest. I'm not talking about being reckless, but wise and calculating. We're going to tear down the strongholds that many of us have long held about the stock market, or we were just never properly introduced to it, all right? Now, that's going to wrap up for today. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Click on the notification bell to receive an alert each time I upload a video. Now, until the next time, take care, my loves, and bye for now.